In 1922, they built the most powerful empire the modern world had ever seen. A nation so vast it stretched across 11 time zones, controlled nuclear weapons that could destroy the Earth 3 times over, and put the first human being in outer space. And then, in just a few days in December 1991, it was gone. No invasion, no nuclear war, no foreign enemy. It collapsed from the inside. This is the story of how the Soviet Union rose to become a superpower, and how the very system that built it destroyed it. Russia, 1917. The country is on its knees. Soldiers are dying by the hundreds of thousands on the front lines of World War I. Back home, ordinary people are standing in bread lines that stretch city blocks. In the middle of winter, children are starving. Mothers are burning furniture just to stay warm. And at the top of it all sits Tsar Nicholas II, a man so disconnected from reality that while his people were eating grass, he was writing in his diary about the weather. The anger had been building for decades, and in February 1917, it finally exploded. Workers flooded the streets of Petrograd. Soldiers, sent to put down the riots, refused to fire on the crowd and joined the protesters instead. Within days, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty was finished. The Tsar abdicated. Russia, for the first time in centuries, had no ruler. But now here's where it gets interesting. Into that power vacuum stepped a man who had spent years in exile, plotting, writing, and waiting for exactly this moment. His name was Vladimir Lenin, and he had a plan. Lenin was a Marxist revolutionary who believed, with absolute conviction, that the entire capitalist world was rotten to its core. He believed that the workers of the world had been enslaved by the rich, and that the only solution was a violent revolution that would tear the whole system down and rebuild it from scratch. A state where no one owned private property, where factories belonged to the workers, where there were no classes, no exploitation, and no poverty. It sounded incredible. But the road to get there? That was going to be brutal. In October 1917, Lenin's Bolsheviks launched their revolution, storming the Winter Palace, overthrowing the provisional government, and seizing control of Russia. But taking power and holding power are two very different things. A civil war erupted almost immediately. The Red Army, Lenin's Bolsheviks, fought against the White Army, a coalition of monarchists, Democrats, foreign powers, and anyone else who wanted the communists gone. The war lasted 3 years and cost millions of lives. When it was finally over, the country was in ruins. By 1921, industrial output had collapsed to just 20% of pre-war levels. 90% of wages were being paid not in money, but in goods, because money had become nearly worthless. 70% of locomotives needed repair. And then came the famine. 3 to 10 million people died of starvation. Lenin looked at the wreckage and made a decision that shocked his own party. He introduced the new economic policy, the NEP. It allowed limited private trade. Small businesses could operate again. Farmers could sell their surplus grain. It was, in essence, a partial return to capitalism. Lenin called it one step backwards to take 2 steps forward. His hardline supporters were furious. But it worked. The economy began to stabilize. And then, in January 1924, Lenin died. He was 53 years old. A series of strokes had slowly stripped him of his ability to speak, to think, to lead. And as he lay dying, he reportedly warned his party about one specific man, a man he said was too dangerous to be trusted with power. He wrote it in a note, a political testament. He said this man was too crude, too ambitious, and too willing to abuse power. The man he was warning about was Joseph Stalin. The party read the note, and then they buried it. Joseph Stalin was not supposed to win. He wasn't the most brilliant mind in the room. He wasn't the most charismatic speaker. He didn't have Trotsky's intellectual firepower or Zinoviev's political connections. But what Stalin had What nobody else in that room fully understood yet was patience, and a memory like a steel trap. While his rivals gave speeches and debated ideology, Stalin was quietly doing something far more dangerous. He was making lists, keeping files, placing his loyal people into key positions across the party, positions that, at the time, seemed boring and administrative. Nobody wanted to be the guy managing party membership records. Nobody except Stalin. By 1928, just 4 years after Lenin's death, every serious rival had been outmaneuvered, exiled, or silenced. Leon Trotsky, Lenin's most likely successor, was expelled from the Soviet Union entirely. Stalin hadn't fired a single bullet to take power. He had simply out-organized everyone else in the room. And now, with absolute control in his hands, he was ready to remake the Soviet Union in his image. In 1928, Stalin launched the first 5-year plan. The goal was staggering in its ambition: transform the Soviet Union from a largely peasant farming society into a modern industrial superpower. In 5 years, steel mills, coal mines, factories, railways, all of it built at breakneck speed, driven by sheer force of will and an unlimited supply of forced labor. And it worked. In a horrifying way, it actually worked. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union had industrialized faster than any nation in history, and cities that didn't exist 10 years earlier were now producing tanks and turbines. The rest of the world was in the grip of the Great Depression, and the Soviets were building something. Whatever Stalin was doing, it looked from the outside like it was working. But the cost was catastrophic. Collectivization, Stalin's plan to seize private farms and merge them into state-controlled collectives, triggered one of the worst man-made famines in history. Farmers who resisted had their grain confiscated anyway. In Ukraine, the famine became so severe that people were dying in the streets. Soviet officials continued exporting grain while millions of Ukrainians starved to death. Historians estimate between 3.5 and 7 million people died. But Stalin wasn't done. In 1936, he turned on his own people. The Great Purge began as a campaign to eliminate enemies of the state, but it quickly became something far more monstrous. Anyone could be denounced. A neighbor, a colleague, even a close friend could whisper your name to the secret police, and within days, you'd be gone. Arrested in the middle of the night, forced to confess to crimes you never committed, either shot in the basement of a prison or shipped off to a gulag labor camp in Siberia, where the winters alone could kill you. Approximately 1 million people were executed during the purge. Millions more disappeared into the gulag system. Stalin even gutted his own military, executing 3 of his 5 top marshals and nearly 35,000 military officers right on the eve of World War II. It was one of the most self-destructive decisions in military history. And in June 1941, and the bill came due. Adolf Hitler, who had signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin just 2 years earlier, a pact Stalin had trusted completely, launched the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border. Stalin, by his own paranoid hand, had just gutted the very army he needed to stop them. The German invasion hit the Soviet Union like a freight train. In the first 48 hours alone, the Soviet Air Force lost over 1,200 aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground before they ever got off the runway. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and captured within weeks. Stalin, the man who had projected nothing but iron confidence for over a decade, reportedly locked himself in his room for days. He was paralyzed. The generals he hadn't executed were calling headquarters in a panic. The ones he had executed weren't calling anyone anymore. By the autumn of 1941, German forces were close enough to Moscow that Soviet officials could see the fires through their office windows. It looked like it was over. But something extraordinary happened. The Soviet people, the same people Stalin had starved, purged, imprisoned, and terrorized, decided to fight anyway. Not for Stalin, not for communism, but for their land, their families, their survival. Mothers sent their teenage sons to the front. Factory workers dismantled entire industrial plants piece by piece and transported them thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of German bombs, and then rebuilt them and kept producing weapons without missing a beat. It was one of the most remarkable feats of human endurance in recorded history. The turning point came in the winter of 1942 at a city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. The battle lasted 6 months. It was fought street by street, building by building, floor by floor. Snipers claimed individual rooms. Soldiers lived inside walls. The fighting was so brutal that the average life expectancy of a newly arrived Soviet soldier was less than 24 hours. But the Soviets didn't break. They encircled the German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, and destroyed it completely. After Stalingrad, the tide never turned back. By May 1945, Soviet soldiers were planting their flag on top of the Reichstag in Berlin. The war was over, and the Soviet Union had paid the most staggering price of any nation on Earth, an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens dead. Entire generations simply erased from the map. But here's the thing about war. It doesn't just destroy. It also crowns winners. And the Soviet Union emerged from World War II as one of only 2 superpowers on the planet. What followed was the Cold War, a decades-long standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States that shaped every corner of the globe. On both sides built nuclear arsenals large enough to destroy the Earth multiple times over. Both sides fought proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, rather than risking direct confrontation. Both sides poured billions into the space race, each trying to prove that their system, communism or capitalism, was superior. And for a moment, it genuinely looked like the Soviets were winning. In 1957, they launched Sputnik, the first satellite ever to orbit the Earth. The entire Western world went into a quiet panic. If the Soviets could put something into orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on the planet. Then in 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being in space. The achievement was so stunning that even American newspapers led with it on the front page. And the Soviet Union was at the absolute peak of its power. But underneath that gleaming surface, underneath the military parades and the space launches and the nuclear stockpiles, something was rotting. The economy was slowing, the leadership was aging, and a system built entirely on fear and control was quietly running out of both. The cracks were forming, and one man was about to accidentally blow the whole thing wide open. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev. He came to power in 1985 as a reformer, a relatively young, energetic leader who understood what the aging men before him had refused to admit. The Soviet Union was broken. The economy was stagnant. The shelves in state stores were empty. The Afghan war, now 6 years old, was bleeding the country dry with no end in sight. And the entire communist system, the planned economy, the one-party state, the iron grip on information, was suffocating any chance of real progress. Gorbachev didn't want to destroy the Soviet Union. He genuinely believed he could save it. So he introduced 2 historic policies. The first was glasnost, openness. For the first time in Soviet history, the press could criticize the government. Yeah, citizens could speak publicly about things that had been whispered only in kitchens for decades. Books that had been banned for generations suddenly appeared in bookstore windows. It felt, to millions of Soviet citizens, like someone had finally cracked open a window in a room that hadn't had fresh air in 70 years. The second was perestroika, restructuring, an attempt to loosen the rigid command economy and introduce limited market reforms, to make the system more efficient, more competitive, more human. What Gorbachev didn't understand, what nobody fully understood until it was too late, was that you cannot crack open a window in a pressure cooker and expect things to stay calm. Then came Chernobyl. On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded, and the blast sent a radioactive cloud drifting across Europe. And the Soviet government's first instinct, true to 70 years of habit, was to lie about it. They downplayed it. They delayed evacuation. They sent firefighters into the reactor without telling them what they were walking into. But this time, because of glasnost, people found out. And when they did, something shifted in the Soviet consciousness that could never be shifted back. If the government had lied about this, about a nuclear disaster happening on their own soil, what else had they lied about? The answer, people were beginning to realize, was everything. Nationalist movements erupted across the Soviet republics. Lithuania declared independence in 1990. Latvia and Estonia followed. In the streets of cities that had been under Soviet control for decades, people were tearing down statues and raising their own flags. The empire was unraveling in real time. In August 1991, hardline Communist Party members had seen enough. They staged a coup, placing Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in Crimea and declaring a state of emergency. They thought they were saving the Soviet Union. Instead, they killed it. Russian President Boris Yeltsin climbed on top of a tank outside the Russian Parliament building and publicly defied the coup. The military refused to crack down on its own citizens. The coup collapsed within 3 days. But so did whatever remained of Soviet authority. One by one, the republics declared independence. Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Georgia. The list grew every week. And on December 25th, 1991, Christmas Day, Mikhail Gorbachev sat down in front of a television camera and resigned as President of the Soviet Union. That evening, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The red hammer and sickle, the symbol that had defined an empire for nearly 70 years, came down in the cold Moscow night. In its place, the Russian tricolor went up. Just like that, the largest country in the world had ceased to exist. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. The Soviet Union is gone, but its ghost never left. Today, Vladimir Putin has called its collapse the greatest geopolitical disaster of the century. He has spent over 2 decades trying to rebuild what was lost: the influence, the fear, the empire. The war in Ukraine is, in many ways, the Soviet Union reaching from beyond the grave. Where the empire fell, but the hunger for it never died.